It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Luis Argueta, who's a friend of the university. And also, I was so grateful he visited our class during the pandemic. Yes. Twice in a row. That was quite an adventure. Chris is remembering those days. Argueta started studying engineering before moving into cinema, film, and cultural studies. And he had come on a scholarship to Michigan to study, but he discovered film. Experimental films, he was telling my undergraduate students back then, when you had to deal actually with film and cut things and edit. He did some experimental movies. His master's movie was a surrealist movie, The Tricycle, that I really enjoyed. He made another movie that was nominated by Guatemala for the Academy Award, El Silencio de Neto, that looks at the coup d'etat against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala at the same time when this young boy is listening to the World Series on the radio and that relationship between the United States and Mexico. For a while, he was working in advertising, doing television commercials. But as he was telling our class recently, in 2001, he decided to do something that was more important than just making commercials. And he started a little project interviewing Guatemalans in the United States, doing short little vignettes in New York, Lynn, Rhode Island, and other parts of the United States. In Pottsville, Iowa, there was a raid in a meat packing plant. And this interpreter wrote in the New York Times an editorial of how he had to be interpreting for 10 people at a time in a court. He went there to make some more of those little vignettes of immigrants. And he ended up staying like 2 weeks and returning like 20-something times. And I think he has changed his life and has made life better for all of us. Since then, he has made 3 movies, and he's working on his 4th movie looking at immigration, both here and in Guatemala. The first movie is Abused, looking at that raid in Pottsville. The second one is The U-Turn, looking at how some of the people who were affected by that raid in Pottsville were able to organize and get U visas from the giving them the opportunity to return to the United States and bring family to the United States. 150 or so visas were obtained. The third movie, which is a beautiful movie, is called Abrazos, looking at mixed status families, kids who are American citizens but who can never have an opportunity to see their grandparents because their grandparents are illegal in the United States. And this church organizes this trip for the kids to go and visit their grandparents. The latest movie he's working on, and he was working on this in the pandemic, and I think he's going to be talking mainly about producing this movie during the pandemic, is called AUSENCIA. And it's a movie that makes us think a lot. It's about the absences caused by migration. What happens in Guatemala, all these people, when all these people have left. At the same time, it looks at the absences of lack of government support, lack of education, lack of government programs that is causing this outside migration. One last statement I would like to make about his movies, and then I'll let him speak. One very interesting thing that we've been thinking about in my classes about Luis Argueta's movies is that they focus a lot on women characters, which is, there has always been female migration, but migration from Central America to the United States was mainly done by men for many years, until the last few decades. And one of the beautiful things about his movies is that women are protagonists, not only victims of an unfair migration system, but as organizers, as nuns, as lawyers, as mothers, as teachers, as community organizers, and they are together responding to their needs. But I'm getting too excited talking about Luis, and I better let him speak. He will speak for a little while. He's going to show us a little trailer of the movie he's been working on, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Good afternoon. It's my honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and to all of you for being here, and to everybody who made this visit possible. As a brief introduction, I'll tell you how I've gotten to this point in my life and what it has meant to find my vocation. Not at the age of 20, like you. At that age, I studied engineering. I am an industrial engineer from the University of Michigan. I then rediscovered film at a time when in the University of Michigan, everything was in flux. Everything was being questioned, which was the total opposite of what was happening in the Guatemala where I grew up, where we were taught to be quiet, to not question the status quo, to not make waves, because that would mean that you could be labeled subversive or worse, a communist. And at that time, to be labeled a communist in Guatemala meant you could lose your head. So now, with all these years behind, I can safely say that my life has been a search for a way to break that silence that I was bred from the time I was born. And the movie that Luis talked about, The Silence of Neto, it's a movie about growing up in Guatemala in 1954. I was not the age of the characters, I was a little younger, but what's important is that that movie I was able to make 40 years later. So it took me 40 years to come to terms with what I had learned as a kid. And it took me 40 years to realize that, as the main character in the film says to his nephew, that silence is sick. That silence will kill you, and you will not be free until you get it out of your system. And I think that's a lesson that in my life has been repeated several times. I came from New York City yesterday in the Acela, and at the new Penn Station in New York and everywhere in the train, you see these pamphlets. And what do those pamphlets tell you? Anybody? And what do you hear often at the subway or at the airports? What is it that there's a mantra that we always hear? If you see,
Say something.
if you see something, say something. And they're referring to bags that are abandoned. But what I always tell my audiences is, if you see an injustice, say something. Call it by its name. Because we only live once and we only have a chance. And if we're as privileged and as lucky to be in an institution like this one, is to, engage in freedom of expression and questioning and asking in dialogue and conversation. But it took me almost a lifetime to come to that conclusion. Well, I made that film, and when the film opened in Guatemala 30 years ago, in 1994, I'll never forget a friend that I had gone to school with. He said, now that you made a communist film, when are you going to make an anti-communist film? So that mentality was still well and alive, or ill and alive. The president that was elected last year and who just took office on January 14th of this year, was a surprise to many people. And to discredit him, they called him a communist. So, there's still a lot of remaining ignorance. and a lot of prejudice. Um, After a lifetime in New York City as a commercial producer and director, I was there on 9/11. And that day, millions of people's lives changed. And I began to question what I was doing, you know, making a very decent living, uh, selling, pushing things that we might not need. And so I think it was out of guilt, out of, I don't know, maybe a little alignment. And I said, I want to do something different. And I began, as Luis said, to interview immigrants in New York, in New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. I remember one night getting lost, totally lost on my way to Lynn, Massachusetts. And finally, I found the place where the Guatemalan consulate was meeting with immigrants. And I would take these short interviews, which for the first time in my life I was doing myself with a small camera. You know, by that time, film was not big cameras with a big crew. You could have a small digital camera. And I would post these interviews on YouTube in a series that I call Voices of Silence. And a few years later, I read about the immigration rate that also we talked about in Postville, Iowa. And what I read was so outrageous, the way that these workers had been treated during the arrest and after they were arraigned and then they were deported. It was totally contrary to what I had learned as an American. By then, I was a US citizen as well. So I went and spent 2 weeks and went back 29 more times, which resulted in my first immigration film, Abuse the Postville Raid. And that was when I said, this is what I really want to go do. And I began to tell stories of immigrants, mainly Guatemalan immigrants, in this country. And 2 more films followed. And then 7 years ago, my wife and I moved back to Guatemala. We adopted a 5-year-old, and we're in the process of getting her naturalization papers. And it's been a long wait, which has provided a lot of anxiety, but at the same time, it has provided my daughter with a really strong identity as a Guatemalan, and me with the space to begin to think about what it is to be a return immigrant. You know, I've always was lucky I had a visa, but spending a lifetime away from the place you were born changes you, and then you see things differently. And part of that is what is informing or trying to inform, because this project that we're going to see work in progress today is it's about that. It's about the other side of the immigration coin, not the immigrants who are here, but the ones that did not emigrate, or in some cases went back, and the ones whose parents left, whose brothers left, whose husbands left, you know, and some of them are very determined to make a living and a life there and to contribute to their communities in ways that are very remarkable. And it's also about, I started to think about something that I never thought about. What did my mother feel when I came here for 4 years and never went back? So there's a lot of things that one confronts when doing this kind of story. I began the film in 2019, and then in 2020, we had edited a 5-minute, more than a trailer. It was a 5-minute extended trailer. And I had to stop because we couldn't travel. But I kept in touch with the characters in the film via cell phones. You know, WhatsApp. I would interview them sometimes and record the calls, and we developed a different kind of relationship than one that usually happens. I go talk to them for a while, show them that I am interested in their stories, but this one extended. And then finally, last year in September, I received the support of a private foundation and allow me to go back and do a week of filming, of interviewing, and it was different than usual. It took more time. The people that I was interviewing would not be willing to make a plan. I wanted to schedule an interview for such and such a day, and that didn't happen. They were very gracious about just making it happen at its own pace. And then I went back to Guatemala, and we edited 7 more minutes into the film. So now it's a 12-minute work in progress. And this kind of sharing of a work in progress is very important to me, because I did the same thing with abuse deposit rate. I showed it at many universities as we were building the film. And the feedback that I received is most welcome and helpful. I'll just say something about the similarities between abuse and AUSENCIA. In abuse, I edited a 7-minute extended trailer from my first 2 weeks in Iowa. And I worked with 3 different editors. And I would say, go edit, let's follow these ideas. And none of those 3 editors were able to do what I thought should be done, which I really didn't know what it was. Finally, I went back to work with that editor that I hadn't worked for a while, and I said, Siki, that's his name, let's take those 7 minutes and open it, stretch it, because I think that we have the beginning, and I think we have the ending. The middle, we'll find it. But let's just put some of the other stories or parts of this big story in the middle. And it worked. And with this film, we tried about 4 months to edit some of the other stories, and it didn't quite work until I told my editor, let's take those 5 minutes, let's open it, let's believe in the beginning, and let's believe in the end. And now we are up to 12 minutes. So it's a technique that I recommend, no? But everybody works differently.
For the dissertations.
Yeah, I think that once I have a beginning and once I have an end, I can relax. So let's watch it and then we can have a conversation.
Ausencia es cuando alguien falta en la familia. Dime tú quién falta en tu familia. ¿Dónde está tu papá? En Estados Unidos. ¿Y en tu familia quién falta? ¿Y dónde está?
Algunos se van en el norte porque tenemos muchas deudas que no podemos pagar aquí.
Aquí faltan juegos recreativos. Faltan columpios, lugares, faltan bancas,
Sillas,
platos, vasos.
cuchillos y hospital también. A veces la gente se lastima, no tiene un accidente y no hay hospitales, así que tenemos que llevarlos hasta Aguacatán o Huehue. Y lo que más falta aquí es el amor de nuestra familia, nuestros padres, tíos y primos, porque todos están en los Estados Unidos y no están aquí con nuestra familia.
¿Qué se siente cuando ellos están lejos?
Se siente horrible, es como si te faltase algo, sientes que te falta un pedazo del alma.
¿Tú qué quieres ser cuando seas grande?
Yo quiero estudiar para ser psicóloga.
¿Por qué?
Porque hay personas que tienen muchos traumas y yo quiero ayudarlos para que esos traumas desaparezcan.
¿Cuál crees tú que es uno de los traumas que tiene la gente aquí?
Yo creo que uno de los traumas que hay más aquí es la ausencia de los padres y tíos y abuelos.
¿Y de qué color es esa ausencia?
Negro.
¿Y tiene olor? Si tuviera olor, ¿a qué olería?
A tristeza.
En la Sierra de los Cuchumatanes, la región no volcánica más grande y espectacular de toda Centroamérica, como la define el historiador escocés George Lovell, conviven bellezas majestuosas con carencias monstruosas. Esas carencias, sumadas a una profunda pobreza y una enraizada corrupción, son el legado de un Estado ausente y algunas de las causas fundamentales de que Huehuetenango tenga la mayor migración irregular de Guatemala.
Pasando 6 meses, mi papá pidió que mi mamá se fuera. Se fue mi mamá para allá con él y yo me quedé en la casa, que los vi crecer. Los vi llorar. Yo los tengo como hijos míos, a los 4. Los tengo como hijos míos porque yo los crecí. Y aunque estén en Estados Unidos, yo les digo, y aunque estén allá, ya están grandes, ya son padres, para mí siempre van a ser mis hijos. La migración es uno de los problemas también que afrontamos como comunidad. En cierta forma, pues es muy triste ver que cada uno de los jóvenes, después de salir de la primaria, ellos deciden emigrar.
Al igual que Sara, Clotilde viene de una familia donde por generaciones la migración ha sido la forma de hacerle frente a las carencias de su realidad.
Aquí vemos la fotografía de mi papá y uno de sus amigos cuando emigró en los años 1980, aproximadamente en el 88. En el lugar donde se quedaba. Acá vemos la fotografía de mi familia. Esto fue aproximadamente hace 19 años. Aquí me encuentro yo, mis 3 hermanos pequeños. Esto fue precisamente en el año 2005. Fue una fotografía para ver y recordar el momento en donde mi hermano, que hoy está en los Estados Unidos, en ese tiempo era un bebé. Mi hermano menor, en ese tiempo había cumplido 1 año. Aquí pues vemos la fotografía de mi abuela, mi mamá, mi hermano mayor, mi hermano menor, que en ese tiempo tenía 6 años, es el que está en los Estados Unidos. Y acá pues es un recuerdo que yo tengo con mis compañeros del básico. Creo que de los 34 compañeros que terminamos básico, el 40% ha emigrado.
¿Quién conoce a alguien que ha viajado, que ha migrado al norte? Todos.
Todos sueñan con irse a Estados Unidos. Y yo, pues no voy a decir no me llama la atención definido, pero no, como que sí, ¿no? Porque Estados Unidos lo único que ha hecho y siento yo es dolor y separación de la familia.
La pareja de Martina, Carlos, migró por cuarta vez un día después de tomarse esta foto.
El viernes por la tarde, todo el desierto. 5 noches con 4 días llevo ahorita. Mira que es un poco difícil, pero a ver qué dice Dios de aquí a mañana.
Vine buscando las razones de los que se van y encontré el vacío que heredan los que se quedan. Esa ausencia que, como dice Borges, rodea al que permanece, como la cuerda a la garganta, el mar al que se hunde.
Carlos iba a salir del desierto apenas lo que fue miércoles por la noche, pero desde ahí ya no sé nada de él.
Ahí acaba. A veces tú vas de lado. Sí.
Because that, as I said earlier, is very beneficial and welcome. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask what inspired you to ask that girl, like in those interviews, about really like the questions about what color is the absence and what does it smell like, because those are obviously physical things that are being applied to a like an emotional feeling. So I was curious how you came to that question.
You know, thank you for asking that. One thing that I've learned in the last, 15 years is that when you ask a question and you have a camera, don't cut. Don't. Because often you're talking to somebody and something personal comes up, your instinct is to change the subject. Or if you have a camera, to cut, because you feel you're intruding. Well, if you do film or video, let the camera roll. And that also allows for silences and spaces that might be uncomfortable. And you might say, well, I already have the answer. She said, it doesn't smell like anything. She said, no. But then, and this is a digression. There was a time when I was very interested in interpreting dreams. And there's a Jungian technique in which assumes that every part of the dream is a part of your subconscious. And if I say, tell me your dream from last night. Did you have a dream last night? Tell me the last dream you had.
I was jumping in the forest, the wood.
You were jumping in the woods, okay? So there were woods, there was the ground, what else was there?
Warriors.
Warriors,
Yeah.
okay? And so the technique goes on, says, what did the warriors tell you?
They were yelling,
They were yelling. What were they yelling?
like, let's go, let's go.
Go. And what did you answer?
Nothing.
Okay, then at that point, I would say, if you had answered something, what would have you said?
That's interesting.
You would have said, that's interesting?
No.
What would have you
I would
said?
say like stop the war. Doesn't worth it.
Stop the war. That, very good. He might be criticized for saying those things. That's good. But see, you don't take the end of a conversation, you don't accept a moment as the end. You ask that question. Well, if you would have said something, what would you have said? And that sort of helps keep the conversation going. And at the end, you might have a semi-decent interpretation of that dream, which is really, the dream is what is in your head at those moments. And the same thing in the interview. I just, you put that idea in her mind. If it had smell, what would it smell like? So that's what I do.
So this is obviously like very personal for you because this is where your grandfather's from and this is your country. And I'm curious, as an artist, when you're looking at making a piece of work, there's obviously so much history as to how you got to this point. A lot of people don't know, but those who do know why it is this way. And I'm curious, how do you stay focused on the piece you're working on and not go off on tangents and have video clips of the history of the coup and all of these things?
It's not easy. And I have a technique that might not be the most efficient to work. I sort of feel that I approach a story by having a lot of material and then chipping at it, sort of like a sculptor that discovers what's inside the stone. And there is you have to be careful not to go into that.
Right.
And those side roads that could make something that I didn't do in Abused and I didn't do in Abrazos, which are the two first films of this group of documentaries, is have anybody except the people on camera tell their stories. So the stories are always from their point of view. But then came this third film called The U-Turn, which involves immigration policies and special visas. And the story was very complex. And I had to accept that we needed a narrator. And because of it, I had an editor who said, the best person to narrate this story is you because you have participated in the events and you know the story. So I gave up and I am the narrator of that second film. And with this one is the same. This is even more personal because I went there because it's where my grandfather came from. Yeah, so it's not something I always do and I like to do, but sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah, so after watching this, I also, during the week, I watched your abuse film. So, like, do you believe that, this was something we also discussed in my class, that the American dream is, like, equal for all people, for all immigrants, or do you think it's really only for those that are born and raised in the United States that have the same opportunities?
If you work hard, you will do anything you want. You can. I think it is a country that has and does provide opportunities for many people, but that people are born with different circumstances, and those circumstances include your nutrition, your family unit, what your life was as a baby, and the education you receive. So if you come here from Guatemala, but you come from a small village like Feliciana's, probably her education is gonna be a lot more deficient than if you came from Guatemala, from a middle-class family and went to a good school and you had good nutrition and had a family that was more together. So it's I think to generalize and say the American dream is the same for everybody is quite a reach. Yeah. Yes.
I want to congratulate you because as a filmmaker, you brought trust into every situation that you went into. And it's obvious from the way people respond to you. And people respond when they can trust someone. And those young people being so open, I credit you for doing that because having a camera crew there, they were focused on you and your conversation and trust. So I congratulate you on that. My second part to that is sort of picking up what was said earlier. Are people opening up that we didn't see about reasons behind leaving other than following family? Economics, et cetera, et cetera.
Say that again. I don't know
Did
if
individuals open up to you on camera about other reasons that they would flee and leave?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And I've also worked as a researcher with Migration Policy Institute. So I've done research and I sometimes might bring that knowledge about what are the causes. Yeah. Yep.
I just wonder if they were that comfortable opening up to the
Yes.
wide range of issues that are
Yeah.
forcing people to
Oh,
leave.
yes. Yeah.
So what you're filming, in a sense, is the presence of the absence. I mean, the beautiful quote of Borges at the end that, it's the noose, it's the sea.
That surrounds the one that is drowning.
So the question I had is, given your own experience, which was so long ago, you said 54, I guess?
It was later, but
Right.
that's
But today, I think the absence must be present in different ways too. I mean, how we have cell phones, right?
yes.
How things have changed.
Very good
Is-
point. Yes, and there are small replacements, or maybe they replace a tiny part of that absence. Not only we have cell phones, we have video cell phones, so people can talk to each other. I think that the best answer I can think of is what a son says about his father who he hasn't seen for 16 years. He's in Minnesota. He says, we call them, we send them money, we talk to them, but we cannot hug them. We cannot give them an embrace. And that film, Abrazos, which means embraces, had this horrible long title at the beginning, and it was the hardest film ever to label, to title. And then one day I said, I'm totally blind. They all say that what they miss is that embrace.
That's what you signed at the end of the letter.
Yes. No, it's true. The phones help, but it's not enough. Yeah. I think sometimes it's even more difficult. Yeah. I was an exchange student in high school, and I remember that I would call my home once a month, and it was just, and we would write letters. And today we think we're communicating all the time, and maybe we're not. But it is how do you film absence? Great question. I don't know. If you see something, say something. And they're referring to bags that are abandoned. But what I always tell my audiences is, if you see an injustice, say something. Call it by its name. Now, with all these years behind, I can safely say that my life has been a search for a way to break that silence that I was bred from the time I was born.
De ningún lado del